Hi, I'm Wayne Tuttle, and welcome to Chasing Legends. Welcome back to Chasing Legends. I'm Wayne Tuttle. I'll be your host this week, and we're going to make a return to the Bark Notes. But before we begin that, please subscribe, hit the notifications bell, leave a comment if you have any questions you have this particular episode. Check out our other episodes, and we have our Legends of the Superstition Mountains and our Dutch Hunter Rendezvous shirts in the short sleeves in black and gray, and we also have now the introduction, the special offers on the long sleeves. We don't make a dime on it, but hey, jump on in there, grab them while they're available. So this week we're going to get back into the Bark Notes, and one of the stories I find particularly kind of very interesting, pretty well documented and noted. A lot of documentation on this particular one, and I have a little story at the end here that goes with it. But it's about the Silverlock and Malm story. So we'll go into the Bark Notes right now and begin that. Just after the Goldfield mine began working, there were two men, strangers in that part of the country, who moved up on the side of the Superstition Mountains about 2 miles from Goldfield. They immediately located two claims, had them surveyed by looks like Nail Lewis of Mesa, established a camp and went to work. They were known as Silverlock and Goldleaf, but afterwards that was corrected. They were called Silverlock and Malm. They were very seldom left their camps, and then only to get supplies, and never both at the same time. They had a team of dun horses, which they used to haul water and supplies. They located on what I considered my now cow range after Criswell, and I had bought the Lamb Boys cattle interest in and around Goldfield, although it was all government land. Still, a cattleman's range rights were respected by all other cattlemen. But mining was considered as having first claim. Now, the area we're talking in particular is, if you're familiar with Goldfield, you look across to kind of a little bit east, a little south, you'll see the massacre grounds. So these guys were in the massacre grounds range, which was kind of the northern end of the western Superstition Mountains. I frequently rode up to their camp and left a piece of beef, for which they always thanked me, and when they were working away from camp, they could always see me coming, and would meet me at the camp and offer me a drink of either whiskey or wine. As soon as I left, they would return to work, digging trenches up the hill until they came to the foot of the cliff. If they encountered any large boulders, they would start blasting them and throw them behind in the trench. Then they would go down below and repeat until they came to the foot of the cliff. Some of those trenches must have taken them years to dig, as they were mining there some 14 years. I could not figure out what they were doing, as it was plain to be seen that they had no vein in place, and it was not a placer ground. And yet they dug. They never talked with anyone that I could hear of. I had a house about 2 miles from their camp, where at times, when they were riding that part of the country, their long ears, unbranded calves, we would stay. One night, Malm came to our camp, woke us both up. John Tuning was there. He was very much excited and wanted us to get back to his camp with him. Silverlock was away, 2 miles from their camp, where at times, when they were riding that part of the country, their long ears, unbranded calves, we would stay. One night, Malm came to our camp, woke us both up. John Tuning was there. He was very much excited and wanted us to get back to his camp with him. Silverlock was away. Malm's legs were full of cactus thorns, and altogether he was a very frightened man. He said that over in the second draw from his camp there was a large party of Indians, squaws and bucks. They were yelling, fighting, and shooting, and he was satisfied that there had been a number of them killed. After we talked to him a while, he calmed down, and we got him to stay all night with us. In the morning I rode over to where the Indians were. They were all dead to the world asleep. John went with Malm to his camp. The Indians were Pimas, and they had been away from their reservation for some time gathering saguaro fruit, which the giant cactus bears at certain times of year. It was very red and sweet, and about the size of a fig, full of seeds. Most all wild animals and birds are very fond of it, and the Indians gather great quantities of it if the season warrants a good crop. But there was one thing I did not know, that they put the fruit in ollas and let it ferment, and then they would get most gloriously drunk on it. For some reason, they wanted to see which one could yell the loudest, and if his voice failed to come up to standard, or he or she would take another drink. Malm told us that night that Silverlock had a ranch up in Idaho and had some trouble with the Indians about some horses. A prospector came along one day, stayed with Silverlock, and helped him with the Indians, as he was a pretty good hand with them. He hung around until Silverlock sold out his ranch, and then asked Silverlock where he was going. Replied that he did not know, and the prospector said, "Why don't you go to Arizona? I can give you a map where there's some very rich ore. I ain't going there. This might be pretty good." He went to his pack and brought out this map and gave it to Silverlock. Silverlock asked Malm to come down with him, which he did. They recognized the location for the map and located 2 claims, and had been there ever since. That they were looking for a vein, there is no possible doubt. Their work would show that. One time in Phoenix, Silverlock and I were standing at the bar of the saloon quite early in the morning, and Silverlock had several drinks. When he said, "Mr. Bark, I have been going to quit work up there. But," and he raised his fist and brought it down on the bar and said, "that float never rolled up the hill, and I will stay there till I die, but what I will find it." Neither of them was a prospector, and as they would have not looked 24 hours for a vein in that tufa debris. This story has very little value towards proving the location of the Lost Dutchman, but further along, when I tell the Sholey story, you'll see the significance of this one. There are a great many people alive today who knew Silverlock and Malm and where they were working. They finally abandoned their camp and moved to Phoenix. Now, it's kind of a shorter story. It's not at great length, but we'll kind of get in and about and around the other side of it here in a moment. Now, part of the interest here is Silverlock and Malm, while Bark is talking about they were digging for a vein. And they say that a lot of that work has been covered up over time, which it has, by the Forestry Service, but some of it remains their camp and their diggings. What had happened is they'd come through that area and they found rich ore, gold ore, on the ground throughout the area. And they've gathered up this, and I've heard all kinds of numbers up to, $10,000, $15,000 worth of ore. They did very, very significantly well. And they put their claims in the area where they were finding this stuff all over the ground laying around. And that was the beginning. It was pretty well documented. And then later, Silverlock and Malm there became mental issues and stuff after obviously over 14, 15 years. And they basically tried to kill each other. One of them was arrested and put into a mental hospital, and the other one just drifted off and away. And they basically put everything they had right back into the whole area. But it's a very interesting area, and even today, if you go up to Massacre grounds, you can work your way over to the area where you saw where some of their diggings, their camp and stuff, and some of the prospects were. It's not as easy to get to. Back in the day, there was a road that went all the way up, and it was a very, very short hike to go out into the Massacre grounds. There was a little small parking area, and you could just walk across that down below the ridge line and work your way over to Massacre grounds. But the road became something of a 6-lane highway of mud ruts and everything else, and everybody just completely just destroyed it. It was in really, really bad condition. I know the last time I went through there before they closed it, it was just, there were ruts sometimes 2 feet deep of where people would go out there in the mud and just tear everything apart. So the Forestry Service shut everything down, so now you have to hike the old road in and then get out there and get to there. But it's still a pretty popular spot. I think there's a lot of people that hike out there, and there's a lot of different various stories about a large major massacre and a number of other things. And I've always kind of been suspect. I know there's the talk of the 2 different massacre grounds. That is a last stand area. And I do have some various thoughts and feelings on it from just looking at it particularly from a perspective of documentation in the area. Now, one of the problems is, and I know there are some, I would say suspect stories, but have never been proven out. But I've never heard of anyone finding really mule bones, human remains, anything like that, anything physical. People have been through there with metal detectors and stuff for so long. So if there was deaths, and I think a lot of the theories point to wherever the Peraltas or the group of Mexican miners were attacked, this was probably a last stand area. And there's a good chance just anything remaining there was probably taken out of there. The massacre story has that the Apaches actually took the mules and burros, cut the packs off of them, and then took them away to a place. And some people feel it was Bluff Springs, some people feel it was Horse Mesa, but took them elsewhere where they kept them for a while and then slaughtered them later. The packs would have rotted and dissipated over a period of time, and likewise with the bones and everything. And the Apaches during that era would literally, and it was pretty well known of any raiding parties of Native Americans, they would strip every piece of clothing. They would take the boots, the pants, the shirts, anything they could, personal items, anything they could sell, trade, or utilize in any way, and sometimes disfigure the bodies. So in that way, if there was a group of, say, 10 or 15 or 20 people, there would be very little chance of finding much in the area. So that there wasn't much found, I mean, you can kind of go one way or the other with it. You can say there should be some trace, someone found something. There's some people that make some pretty big arguments about some diaries and journals and historical type stuff. But what I know is the Silverlock and Malm story, and what those guys did is they covered that ground inch by inch by inch once they found that ore. And they found the ore, but they never found anything else of significance. So it was like the ore had been dropped there. And that's most people's theory, is that's one of the areas, the last stands of some of them, or perhaps even still, there never was a massacre, and what happened there was that the burros or whatever had worked their way back up into there after they tried to be making it out on the flats, and they'd been murdered maybe down in the Goldfield area. And the burros and the animals had worked their way up that way after, and perhaps that's where the Apaches found them. They cut the sacks, let the ore fall. There is no mineralization. I don't think anybody, I even prospected in there a bit. I've never known of anyone finding anything except what was found on the surface, which leads us to another very interesting story. Now, probably, I'm going to say, this is about 1975-76, and there was a group of us, and we were working our way through the Superstitions. We were heading to Pinion Camp from First Water, and all the gear was loaded, and we were working our way in, and there were two individuals, quite young, probably late teens, early 20s, that were in the group, and they went out over towards the massacre grounds, and they were going to work their way that way and then cut back and then join us later, but they were going to make a foray from there, from First Water over to the massacre grounds, and then cut back through the mountains and meet us. And they gave us a particular area. They told us they were going to search and kind of wanted to look in. They wanted to look in some of the draws and some of the canyons, going working their way up from there. They came down very excited back into camp. They caught us actually just before we got camp. They pretty much ran all the way till they caught us. We had most of their heavier gear. They had some gear on them, but they were able to make a really good time. And they ran and caught up to us and said, they got back in there and they showed us what they found. What they had, and I don't have a piece of it, but it was about pieces this big, of nice ore. It had gold through it. And they'd found this up into this one area by this larger rock. It's not the rock that's centered in massacre grounds. This was more to the northeast of the area. And a number of people I spoke to about this story, we talked about it at length, because we always wondered if any of the burros that got loose or were wandering off, they might have wandered up into these areas or chased back into these areas if they were and they might have been slaughtered or grabbed there and the bags cut. And they found a number of these pieces. The largest were like what I just showed you. There was some smaller pieces too, but they looked around for a significant amount of time and they found this stuff. And it was all surface buried. It was all stuff just sitting there on the surface. So it kind of was the only time, and I wish I would have been able to, and I've tried over time to kind of track these guys, because I'm sure the pieces are gone. Within a year or two or three, I never heard anything about it again, so I'm sure something happened to them, or they gave them away, sold the pieces or whatever, someone else got their hands on them. And there's almost another story to deal with that, that group of people and some of the people involved, which I'll touch on here in a minute. But I don't know what happened to them. I remember hearing the story, and I was And I was pretty young. I was probably 11 or 12 at the time. And it was very exciting because it was the first time I had heard or knew of anybody that had actually found something and got to see it. And everybody was really questioning it because they knew the Silverlock and Malm story and the fact that they had found the ore, so they thought they had found some loose pieces up in this area. So it was one of those few times that you're kind of like, wow, okay, it's a good documented story, but here's something that provides and works truth with it. And I remember the gentlemen's names, and I've always kind of put a word out to see if I could find them, and I haven't. So chances are is they were younger, probably a good 10 years younger than me and something. Neither of them may ever even be around or anything and all this. And I don't believe they made up the story because everybody saw it, and there was adults in there in their 30s and 40s, and they were looking at it. And it was very interesting. So that touches upon that story, which kind of goes with the Silverlock Malm story. Always made it interesting to me. One of the things I've always found fascinating is, well, we have camp ore, and of course the supposed deathbed ore, and there's different, we have the Cochera ore, which Ron Feldman still has. But I've always inquired is that no one has ever seemed to keep, nobody has any of the samples from Silverlock and Malm of that ore. That was all shipped out, I guess with the expectation there would be more. So there is no massacre ore, and that would be one of the most interesting pieces to have to identify with, since the story seems to identify with the Peraltas and the Peralta mines. So that would be a piece. And Frank and I have always talked to going up there and checking some of those nooks and crannies that others have talked about. But we're talking 100 years of people just ripping through that place. And the fact that nobody's found anything ever since that time tells me that probably every little scrap, anything that was there, was probably picked up, gathered up, found its way in personal collections, and it's just disappeared. What makes the story even more interesting is this group of people, as some of them later would talk, there was a map, and I know we made a trip in and they disappeared. We set up at Pinion, and I'm trying to think, we might have went down into what was Willow Canyon, which is Peralta Canyon now, and that's one of those things is I gotta always remember is names change. Willow Canyon is not Peralta Canyon anymore, but it was, we might have been out camped down in the lower end of Peralta Canyon after we had been at Pinion. But this group spent about a week up in somewhere around Ed Piper's camp or somewhere there, and they were kind of making excursions from there. They got a map from a gentleman, and the two people that found the ore I believed was part of this group, and I knew one of the brothers of this group. And years later we were camped and we were talking about it, and I asked him, what was that whole thing about? And I guess they'd hooked up with some guy over in the general area of, say, 27th Avenue and Northern and or Olive, Dunlap. Sorry, I got to get the street straightened out. It's Dunlap at 27th Avenue by Cortez High School. And they told me that these guys had hooked up with some guy and he had a map and stuff, and they purchased the map and they showed him the ore. So that might have been what happened to the ores. They had all this information, so there was kind of a trade went on monetarily. Well, it was years later I found out that for a period of time in the Metro Center area, right in that area where they were talking about at 27th Avenue and Dunlap, Crazy Jake Robertson Jacobs happened to live for a while or a period of time. And I found this from another source who had been talking and said, yeah, I got to know him briefly, kind of this, this period of time where he was not really healthy and all this, and his bigger days were behind him. But he was talking about when he was living right along there, and he told me where the house was. I got it written down somewhere, but then I suddenly put these stories together and realized that's probably the guy those guys came in. They lived in the general same neighborhood, and probably when he came in, they'd had a lot of experience in the mountains, and that's how they all ended up connected. And that's a good chance of where some of that ore might have ended up, and where they probably got their map and their information from, because it really makes sense. A bunch of these guys as well knew and had been in the mountains when they were younger and knew Al Morrow. So a lot of this kind of ties in. It's always one of those interesting things with research when you're looking at a general story and then all the particulars of different individuals start to line up, and you go, well, I knew them, and I didn't know he lived here, and he probably partnered with them or did this, and that was one of those cases. But Silverlock and Malm, very interesting story. There's a number of different stories, and like I said, it was kind of a bitter end for them, but they did find gold, but it was all on the surface, and it wasn't placer. It was all surface gold that it came from possibly the packs that the Apaches had claimed that they had cut loose and dumped all the yellow rock on the ground in that area. So there's a good chance, and who knows, if you want to, go out there with your metal detector, go out there and just kind of eyeball it, and after a good rain, who knows what you'll find up in there in the nooks and crannies where some poor burro would have gotten away. So interesting story. The bark notes, we'll continue with those. I know a lot of people love hearing the bark notes. They've told me personally. Some of this narration is they just don't actually watch the videos. They just listen to it kind of like a podcast. And I've talked about doing some long streaming versions of some of this stuff, so we'll continue to do so. But thanks for joining me. Silverlock and Malm story from the bark notes as we return to the bark notes for another section. And there's some of the longer ones that are kind of general stories we may head to further down the line, but I want to kind of hand pick them for stuff that I don't see out in the general area. I know a lot of people kind of like come out and self-profess that they're the experts, and they want to put stuff up. Jim Bark was an expert, and that early manuscript's definitely a great source material. It doesn't give you in depth necessary to the Silverlock Malm story, but gives you something of an overview of his knowledge and kind of what he thought of the area. Obviously, Bark doesn't mention the fact that he had heard that they got this stuff, but it's a pretty well documented story. So that's a pretty cool thing about it. Is we know they both existed. We know what happened to their partnership. We knew of the time period they were there and what they actually found and why they ended up sitting there for so long, because they really thought there had to be a mine somewhere in that vicinity, which I don't think they ever found anything, and I don't think anyone else has ever found anything. So thanks for joining us this week on Legends of Superstition Mountains. Again, sign on up, subscribe to us, hit the notifications and whatnot, and we'll catch you next week for another episode of Legends of the Superstition Mountains, Chasing Legends.